Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome back to Eastern Iowa Community Colleges, also known as MCC. I'm Kirk Thompson. I am one of the board members for the Indigenous Coalition of Muscatine. We like to put some of our events on here. I think it's our third event here. Our President and Justice Psych is right here. Thank you all for being in attendance this afternoon. I am here to introduce Nick Stewart. He is working on his capstone. Well, I hope it's done if he's going to present it. But he's working on his capstone project, Dakota Detention Davenport. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and get the ball rolling. We were a little behind on some technical difficulties. But everyone, please welcome Nick, and we'll get started.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Live in the back here. Can I figure out how this works? No, I really don't want to bother with it. For slide moving purposes, I can just use the clicker that's up here. Correct. Just making sure. All right. Yeah, as they said, my name is Nick Stewart. I am a master's student at Northwestern College in Orange City out in Western Iowa. Red Raiders. Anyway, I'm never going to figure this out, am I? That's so much better. Check, check, check. There we go. All right. And so in the process of this, I was just kind of, again, going through this whole thing, trying to explore local history a little bit more within the process of like my master's capstone. And so I kind of came across this as an overall topic. Now, we work. Just a few quick acknowledgments here before I get into it. Just a couple people I want to say thank you to. First, I'd like to thank the Davenport Public Library and Augustana College for giving me access to their archives. A lot of great information in there, things I would not be able to get my hands on otherwise. I'll get into it a little bit more, but this is a topic that is, I would call it a very Midwestern topic, and meaning that is that it's involving a lot of places, it involves a lot of people. It also is a very decentralized type of topic in terms of where the resources are. And so it's spread out in the Dakotas, in Minnesota. There are sources that are even in like the National Archives in DC that I would not be able to get my hands on otherwise if it was not for that access. I'd also like to thank my professor, Dr. Kosoman, for her feedback and support through this process, and also my family for making sure that I don't break down and cry. All right. So let's get into the focus of this. And so within the focus of this topic, I was centering around then the Dakota imprisonment at Camp Kearney in Davenport, Iowa from 1863 until 1866. You've heard of this, right? Right, obviously. I'm trying to look then at this reciprocal relationship that existed between these people that were then imprisoned within the camp, and also then with these Christian missionaries that were also advocating for justice and their freedom within this context. I also want to look at the way that Dakota were able to use the tools that were available to them to basically kind of turn assimilation efforts on its head, and the way that they were able to use their own agency in the process here to basically maintain their cultural identity, and also then kind of keep a cultural history going on for like the next generation. Okay. And so here's just a quick outline for you guys. We'll start off with a little introduction. We'll get into the Dakota War itself of 1862. Because I did not really know a whole lot about that before I started researching this. We'll get into the detention in Davenport. We'll talk about the resilience, the survival aspects of it, and then I want to get into a little bit of remembrance, and we'll have time for a little bit of question and answer, depending on how fast I talk. All right. So let's go. Section 1, little introduction. Okay. Now, I teach history up at the high school. They let me teach history at the high school. And one of the things I really try to emphasize with a lot of our students is that there is history all around us, right? You have to think about the feet that you're walking on and what you're stepping into. I'm a Midwestern boy, and my entire life, I was always thinking to myself, wow, Midwestern history is insanely boring. I remember hearing about Willa Cather, sod houses, buffalo, and I'm like, none of this interests me. And I think a lot of why we're not able to make those connections, though, is because we have not always done a great job of remembering where we're stepping. And I think that is also what we need to get to with this as well. And so history's all around us, even in the Midwest. And so we need to be cognizant, we need to be aware, we need to actually be digging into the places that we're stepping, because some of our ancestors have maybe not done a great job of preserving or remembering some of these instances, and it's important that we take the time, take the effort to look back at our past to understand where we're going and, again, where we're walking. Okay. And so why study the Dakota in Davenport to begin with, right? They're a tribe that largely lived in Minnesota during this period and now lives in South Dakota. They also have a reservation in Nebraska. They were in Davenport for a couple years. Why do we care about this niche Midwestern topic? Well, let's just say that, right? It is a niche Midwestern topic. Little is paid attention to this, and especially when we look at the historiography that relates back to the Dakota War itself, much of it is based in Minnesota, or then in the eventual reservations that'll be out in South Dakota, right? There is not as much scholarship that exists going into the Iowa portion specifically, and this is part of our regional history is the way that I would say it. The other thing, though, is that this has huge ripple effects within American history. It's a very small little tidbit of an event, of a historical thing to look at, but it has wide-ranging impacts. Historian David A. Nichols described the Dakota War and also the internment in Davenport as a microcosm of what was happening in America at that time. It's what we want to understand. If we want to understand who America is, this is where we look. It is a story that has implications way beyond the particular events. And so this gets into what we talk about with Native American boarding schools and education, where we talk about the way that treaties were done and the ways that reservations were ultimately established and the history that goes with that. We see all of that here. And again, it is showing the establishment of that policy within the United States. All right. Let's get on to section 2. Let's talk about this conflict a little bit. Let's talk the context. Let's talk the conflict. Okay. And so the first part that we got to get to, we're talking about the Dakota or the Santee Sioux. Who are they? So they're a band, a tribe that exists within Minnesota then by the 1860s, right? Wait. It's fine. You guys can see here in the image on the left, this is Chief Little Crow. You can see that he is dressed in traditional Dakota garb. He is also going to be the leader within this conflict. This is also sometimes referred to as Little Crow's War. And then you guys can kind of see a rough map of where they're located. All the things that are in green are going to be then what would have been traditional homelands. Orange then is what is now modern day reservations. I was looking at a quote from, I think it was the Minnesota Encyclopedia going through this, and somebody described the United States as the United States of Dakota because they had a huge wide-ranging span over the United States that then is crushed into then these smaller reservations. If we are looking at the Dakota itself, they are comprised of 4 bands. They refer to themselves as Asante, meaning ally. The Dakota that we're going to be looking at, the Eastern Dakota, are going to be living in southern Minnesota. Southern Minnesota is very important to them. The place where the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers meet is featured heavily within their creation myths. It's a very holy area. It is going to matter a lot then given the context of what is going to be happening. It's going to matter even more when they're ultimately forced out of there by the Minnesota state government and they are forbidden to return upon threat of death. If we look at lifestyle, they're semi-nomadic. Again, like a lot of other plains tribes, they move around based on season. And so they'll do winter quarters then where they'll kind of stock up. And then by the time you get to spring, there's going to be basically a separation where the men are going to go off into hunting parties. Women and children then are going to stay back, do some farming, do a little bit of preservation of food, and that side of things. Dakota religious practices are interesting. They do see an element of holiness in everything. This could go from a rock to a bird to a buffalo to the wind. And so when we are trying to look at this relationship between missionaries and them, the missionaries have a huge issue with trying to understand the way that they're practicing religion. And so when the Dakota are going to be we'll worship this God you've got going on here. We see holiness in everything, whereas then for the missionaries, it's going to become almost adversarial in a context, but I'll get more of that in a second. A big part as well with the Dakota or the Santee is kinship. It's important to be a good neighbor, which also I feel like the missionaries could tie that in as well with the idea of love your neighbor. It's important to have good manners, a sense of responsibility, and you should treat everyone you come in contact with as your kin. And so we will see this interesting relationship where, yes, the missionaries will try to utilize that idea of kinship with the Dakota, but it's going to happen a lot more in the reverse, where the Dakota are going to be speaking to the missionaries as though, hey, brother, or most dear friend, in a way to say, hey, I I am your kin. I am suffering at this point. You need to do whatever you can to help me. And it does show then this growing relationship, but also I would say leveraging in a way where the Dakota are trying to utilize, I would just say, an element of whiteness to their advantage. Let's see here. Cool. All right. And I got into that a little bit already. Awesome. Cool. And so this is what a Dakota village would have looked like. This is circa 1845, and so a lot of the events we're going to look at are going to be around 20 years later. This is going to be along the Mississippi River. We can see then some teepees there going along the bluffs. We are able to see canoes, so there's going to be fishing. But again, it's going into that like semi-nomadic type lifestyle. Okay. Gonna go. Oh no. There we go. All right. And so we kind of have an understanding of who the Dakota are. Now let's start to meet some of these people that they're going to have in contact with, who's they're going to try to leverage these kinship ties. The two missionaries that I came in the most contact with were two guys named Thomas Williamson and Stephen Riggs. These are their images. How can I say this here? They're also the ones that are going to have the longest lasting relationship. And also I'd say the largest impact. By the time the Dakota War actually takes place, these are the only two guys that are left. And so starting off in the 1850s, there is larger like accounts of missions. There's going to be double-digit Christian missionaries that are operating in the area with their families. By the time, I would just say like the shooting starts, these are the only guys that are going to be left, which also shows their commitment to the Dakota as well. Dr. Thomas Williamson is an interesting figure. He's going to serve as a medical doctor. He's also going to be working in like southern Minnesota. He's also going to follow the Dakota to Davenport as well and serve as an advocate within the camp. He also then serves as a translator. Both of them are fluent in Dakota. Williamson is also going to then be a big advocate for overall justice. And so he's going to say that within the context of these people who are imprisoned within the Camp Kearney Davenport prison, that they all should be declared innocent and then freed. Whereas Stephen Riggs here, who also is going to be an important figure, he is going to be a little less lenient. He is going to advocate for a sense of justice, but I would say he's more Old Testament God rather than New Testament God. He's like, hey, these people have committed crimes, supposedly. They've been found out by a court, and they need to face justice. Riggs is very interesting, and both of them really are. Within the sense of this, and how would I say this here? A lot of the Dakota sources that we have, it's a lot of oral history, which is hard to kind of parse through because, again, it becomes very personal, which I do rely on a sense of oral history. But a lot of the cultural things that we have that relate back to Dakota, like way of life during this time, come from these two men. They kept a lot of letters, they kept a lot of journals that have thus been preserved and that I leaned on heavily within this situation where Dakota voices could not be found. And so their ability then to preserve these letters that were passed back and forth between them and the Dakota or their own journals helped a lot, is the easiest way I would say it. Okay. This is the part that like I just find fascinating, and I hope that I can kind of get you guys on board with this too. These missionaries are different. They really are. And so when we actually study this portion of American history, we come across this part where it is very far between where people actually view people of other races as equal, which I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, and it kind of sucks, but here we are. And so when these people are looking at race, these missionaries, when they come into Minnesota, I've got a couple interesting ideas that I'd like to share out. First off, they believe in what's called monogenetic theory. It was popularized in the early 1800s. That was within like the social system at the time. Thomas Jefferson also believes this to an extent. The idea, though, is that we all came from a similar genetic bond, which, like, cool, we got it. You know, we're kind of progressing here. They believe then that corruption is caused by environment. And so when these missionaries see the Dakota, they're like, hey, I see you as potentially a full human. You got to get rid of that Dakota culture. And so they are going to have the full intention of trying to then treat these people with humanity and advocate for justice because they do see them as people, but only to the extent that they are adopting white customs and culture. And so it turns into this really interesting kind of yo-yo seesaw type situation where the Dakota are, we can discuss the whole legitimacy of some of their conversions and their assimilation, but we are playing the game to then advocate for justice by then adopting, to a sense, some of these like white cultures and practices. Let's see here. Yeah. And so like they thought that like, hey, if these people became settled farmers, if they cut their hair, if they then like stopped having multiple wives as another part of their religious practices, that would then make them equal within white society. Within like Dakota culture, they viewed Dakota culture as literally demonic. We have a couple quotes here that Samuel Pond, one of the first missionaries to come to the Dakota, described their villages as strongholds for the Prince of Darkness. This kind of does fall in line with the later idea of kill the Indian and save the man. Samuel Pond is also noticed for saying, the Dakota had all the elements of true manhood. Let us not regard him as though he did not belong to the same race with ourselves. As a man, he is by nature equal to the white man, which is, well, if we look at other source material, this is very few and far between people who are actually going to progress this or profess this even in other progressive circles. Let's see here. Yeah, and so one of the things that the missionaries found out as they were going through things is that they wanted to try to convert these people at any means possible. And so one of the things that they found out, though, was that the most annoying part that they were kind of coming across was that it sucks to teach people English. It's very hard. And so what is interesting about these people is that as we see in later boarding school efforts, like as we go into like the 1880s, 1890s, think like Carlisle Industrial School, that they would then say, hey, you cannot learn the language. They would try to like get after these people young. They would try to shut down their culture. Here in this situation, though, they're going to flip it on its head. And in fact, actually, like Riggs and Williamson and Samuel Pond are all going to learn Dakota. They're going to become fluent, and they're actually going to create the alphabet. And so they're going to make like basically like a Romanized alphabet that is for the Dakota language. And so they are able to read, write, and then teach these Dakota then literacy, which is interesting. But also too, like it sounds like a great thing on paper, right? We're trying to then educate these people so they can have agency. At the same time too, they are doing it as a way of conversion, right? Of proselytizing, and also as a way then to control the language itself, right? The person who is making this, Samuel Pond, is a missionary, and his whole idea though is that, hey, we want to be able to control the written word here because that's how history ends up getting made. And so we see this really interesting duality of missionaries, right? Is that, hey, we're trying to educate these people. We see them as fully human, but also too, we want to destroy literally everything about their culture, right? We want them to then become as much like us without then like the language part, which I would still say is interesting, and it does offer the Dakota room for autonomy. Okay. It is fascinating, actually, because they really do view the Dakota language as like a civilized language, which will come up here in a second. Okay. On the flip side, though, there's going to be the government efforts as well. And there's going to be some government efforts that are going to take place. At some points, the missionaries are going to work with the government. Other times, it's going to be very adversarial. And partially, that's because as time goes on, the missionaries realize that the government's not treating the Dakotas fairly. They're not offering a level of justice, and it's actually causing things to get worse. And so as we kind of see things go on, and I thought this was fascinating to take a look at. And so in 1850, when Minnesota first becomes a territory, its population is 6,000 people. A lot of sparse settlements here. Again, we see Germans, Swedish immigrants coming into the area. And then by 1860, right, it is going to then boom into 172,000 people. Right? There is going to be, again, it's like a land gold rush in a sense. And the Dakota have the best land. And so what's going to end up happening then is a series of treaties which are dubious and unequal. This is not the focus of this topic, and so I don't need to get into everything. But one of the big ones is it's going to be a treaty called Traverse de Sioux. The Dakota are going to end up selling 21 million acres for roughly $1.6 million. Now, whenever these treaties happen, they don't get the cash outright. There's always stipulations. And so within this, there was going to be $275,000 to relocate the Dakota onto their new reservation. And then they would receive $40,000 in cash every year. And they would also get $10,000 worth of supplies every year, right? And so it's a way then, one, to like kind of keep the Dakota in line. Because if you are going to be warlike, if you're not going to abide by your part of the treaty, then the government is going to cut off that sense of money. And that becomes something that the Dakota are going to rely on, right? And at the same time, too, like the government is coming off with a fire sale. They're going to be able to make a lot more money off of this land, but the Dakota will take it over then getting forced off their land. I'll show you guys a map here of what this ends up looking like, but the new reservation is tiny. It is going to extend just 10 miles to either side of the Yellow Medicine River, and it's going to be around 250 miles long, and I'll show you guys a comparison here in a second. There's also going to be wide-scale corruption. So on these reservations, they're operating then with different Indian agents, and these Indian agents then are not treating people fairly. They're skimming money off the top. They're also then like not allowing for supplies to come through either. And so there's this level of adversarial like relationship between the Indian agents, the missionaries, and then the Dakota as well. Another thing that I thought was interesting as well is that, and this is kind of where it shows the level of injustice, is that when this treaty was passed off, they sign it, the Dakota think how cool this is done, but the treaties have to go through Congress, and Congress is able to alter the treaty then without the Dakota's consent. Whereas they originally had negotiated for a permanent settlement, a permanent reservation in Minnesota, the Senate then was saying, we're gonna take that back. You guys get 10 years of here, and then we're gonna kind of pick and choose after that. And so it's this thing where, again, the rug is being pulled out from under them. There's going to be less trust within those government circles. And even the missionaries are going to come out and say, this is ridiculous, which is, again, going to cause a strain between government entities and these missionaries. All right. Let's take a look at the map here. And so you guys are able to see that we can see the different land cessions that are happening. The Dakota then are going to be towards the yellow, towards the bottom. And we can see here, and I wish I had like a laser pointer. If you guys look in that bottom leftish corner where there's that strip of land that's going across the river, that's going to be their entire reservation. And so considering that these people are semi-nomadic, that they are used to living off the land and not doing intensive agriculture, this is essentially destroying their way of life. This is saying, hey, the only option you have here is to assimilate, otherwise you will starve. And especially with the amount of settlers that are going to be coming in, it's going to be hard to have that little of a space then for this group of people. Okay. I can get a little closer here so you guys can get a better view. But again, all they get is that little strip of land, and that's kind of the context that we're going into as we get into the imprisonment and the war itself. All right. So let's talk about what was happening in Minnesota at the time to kind of like start this war off. And so this is 1862. The Civil War is going on. It's raging on in the background. There's a lot of Minnesotans that are leaving to go fight. But also then, as this is happening, there's going to be large drought and crop failures. And so there are some Dakota that have become settled agriculture like settlers. They're called short hairs, meaning then that they've cut their hair, they've largely become Christian, and now they're doing settled, like I would just say, like very white agriculture. And they are going to be really affected then by the drought, like the drought and the crop failure. At the same time, though, there's going to be long-haired Dakota, which is going to be most of the population still, who are going to still be living semi-nomadic lifestyle. But again, you have all these settlers coming in. You are going to have then a limited game also because of drought. And so they're also going to be starving. This is going to cause a lot of stress on the Dakota. And so one thing that we're going to kind of take a look at is what is overall happening here. And so I already said then that the Dakota get money once a year. Well, old Honest Abe, he's really busy right now. He can't pick up the phone. And also, hey, the money's a little late. And so the Dakota then are starving. They then do not have the money that was promised of them. And even worse, the Indian agents that are there are refusing to then give people food on credit. And so we're all of a sudden having the situation where Little Crow is pleading with one of the Indian agents then to give them food. They're sitting outside one of the warehouses, and this is what has been recorded down for us. He says, "We've waited a long time. The money is ours, but we cannot get it. We have no food, but here are these stores filled with food. We ask that you, the agent, make some arrangement by which we can get food from the stores, or else we may take our own way to keep ourselves from starving. When men are hungry, they help themselves." And apparently, according to our sources, then that last sentence was said very ominously. Now, the Indian agent, his name was Merrick, he came back and he looked Little Crow in the eye and said, "You can eat grass for all I care." And also, he also said something about them eating their own excrement as well. The reaction that Little Crow had from this, he ended up walking away, but word about this traveled very fast. There was a group of young Dakota that were very angry about this. They were starving, and they ended up storming this warehouse, taking food, and they also then began raiding white settlements within the area. The story goes then that as the fighting starts, Merrick was found dead, and his mouth was filled with grass. Now, this is a very short conflict, relatively. It's like around 5 weeks or so that's happening. The Dakota are going to see initial successes. They're going to do a lot of raiding of homesteads and settlements. They're going to be capturing a lot of prisoners, mainly women and children. There's going to be atrocities that are going to happen on both sides, whether you would call them massacres. There's also going to be cases of rape and sexual assault that are going to be happening as well. Right? It becomes a very important event in southern Minnesota history. The other thing, though, is that like a lot of the Dakota want to stay out of the conflict. They don't want to fight with this because they know it's not in their best interest. And so there's going to be cases where people are going to be forced to fight by then like pro-war Dakota out of threatening or like, again, threatening to their family. And so these people will go out and they will fight, quote unquote, right? But in a lot of cases, they're going to say, hey, I either shot in the air, I shot at buildings, or I maybe shot at an animal then out of my own safety. Right, so then I would not then be guilty of this crime. We also have a lot of cases of some of these short hair and also long hair Dakota actually saving white settlers in the area, where they were saying, hey, these people are gonna come and get you, get out of here. There's also cases of protection happening at some of the missionaries' houses and also at some of the schools. And so they are showing then, hey, we do not wanna be like this. We do not really want to be a part of this conflict. This is against our wishes. The issue though is that, well, there's conflict. There's massacres that are happening. The Minnesota town of New Ulm was burned to the ground in the process of this. News travels fast. The militia is able to then muster. The Dakota they are defeated. Now, the thing is, though, is that the state of Minnesota wants blood. And they want it now. And so basically then, I'll just read this quote I have here from Carol Chomsky, a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. There ended up being trials, and the trials of the Dakota were conducted unfairly in a variety of ways. The evidence was sparse, the tribunal was biased, the defendants were unrepresented in unfair proceedings, and they were unfairly conducted. In a foreign language, an authority for convening the tribunal was lacking. More fundamentally, neither the military commission nor the reviewing authorities recognized that they were dealing with the aftermath of a war with a sovereign nation, and that the men who surrendered were entitled to treatment in accordance with that status. Basically, they were not given a fair trial. It was a kangaroo court, and more often than not, these people wanted retribution, not justice. What ended up happening then is that we're going to see roughly 392 prisoners tried. 303 of those people are going to be sentenced to death, and then we're also going to see 16 prison terms going to be carried out as well. And so you are going to have 303 people that are going to be sentenced to death then, and a lot of them are professing their innocence. We have a lot of those people who actually then were saving white families in the process here that end up getting caught up in this nonsense. Abraham Lincoln kind of comes across this. This looks like really bad press for the U.S. And so what he says is, hey, we got to readjust the way that we're doing this. We can't kill all 303 of these people. And so they're able to settle on 38. 38 men are going to be hung, and you guys can see the image here. This is going to take place in Mankato in 1862. This is the largest mass execution in American history. And I believe that the fact that we do not talk about this in this context, in this sense, also then shows where some of our values might be at in the sense of our desire for justice. The remaining then that were sentenced to death, that were not hung, were then sent to Davenport, Iowa, partially out of fear of their own safety. There were cases then of people in Minnesota basically calling for blood. There was a case of, as they were being marched through the city of New Ulm, that a series of women actually came upon some of the Dakota, attacking several of them that were in a train, wounding 10 and killing 1 in the process. And so they're like, hey, this is not a safe place for these people to be. Let's take them down to the lovely city of Davenport, Iowa. So let's talk about the Dakota and Davenport here, the topic that we're here for. All right. And so what we're going to see here is they're going to arrive on April 24th, 1863. And as they're coming into Davenport, picture our beautiful river, right? We've got beautiful flowing waters. We have the water going up onto the shoreline, and all around there are people that are aware that the Dakota are coming. And so we're going to see just a large group of people that are going to watch these people disembark. It's like a spectacle. The Muscatine Daily Journal reports that a large number of our citizens visited the boat to gratify their curiosity by a sight of the Indians. And so, well, I live in Davenport. I commute every day. I think it's a little long sometimes. I can't imagine doing this in the 1860s. And so showing that, hey, this is how big of a spectacle it is, that people are coming all the way from Muscatine, also then shows how interesting this is for people. As they're being disembarked from the steamship, any prisoner over the age of 14 was shackled, and then soldiers basically lined the path from the steamship then that goes into the prison. Okay, So let's talk about the structure of this prison itself. So the prison's called Camp Kearney. It is an offshoot of basically a camp that is a mustering point for Civil War soldiers that are going to be either mustering in or mustering out. It's called Camp McClellan. You guys can still see Camp McClellan related things in the village of East Davenport today. The camp ended up being roughly around 200 square feet. It has 4 buildings, all made very cheaply, that were former barracks. There's going to be 2 living quarters for the men, a hospital, and then they're also going to bring along roughly 16 women and children that are meant to do basically some of the cooking and the cleaning. Excuse me. The other thing that's interesting too is that this is like a pen. It's described in several of our sources as a pen, and there's going to be a walkway that's going to be raised around, so then the soldiers are able to go and view down at them. Feels almost like a zoo. Now, when we see some of these prisoners, we have a wide range of ages. So the average age here, according to our records, is 28, but we have some people that are very, very young, considering that there's children here, but there's also going to be people that are very, very old. And so considering then those overall conditions, there's going to be a wide range of needs that are going to need to be happening, and we're going to see how well that the camp is actually able to administer this. Of the prisoners that are here, they are mostly sentenced to death. They just haven't been hung yet. And so we're going to see cases of the prisoners being mocked, jeered by the commandant of the camp, basically saying hey, I'm going to hang you tomorrow. And so having that while you're in this camp, you're in a foreign environment, and you are constantly being told, hey, you might die tomorrow. They are not being treated like prisoners of war. They're not being treated like humans. And so within this context, it's important for us to remember this, again, in the larger ideas of American history. Now, living within the side of the camp, it wasn't fun. So numbers vary on how many prisoners were actually here, because our records aren't great. I would say within the 300 to 400 range, but again, there's specific numbers that are thrown out by different historians. But again, there's going to be a decent amount of people. Within these different barracks, they are going to be living, right? They have 2 barracks for the men. They took the beds out, and so these people are sleeping on the floor. These buildings are meant to be cheap. They're put up in a very hasty manner. Stephen Riggs, when he is visiting the prison, notices that it's a drafty and uninhabitable place. He said, we were so cold and uncomfortable that I could hardly stay 2 hours at a time. And so he is then they're just visiting. He has the agency to get out based on his privilege. And yet he is hey, this is not up to snuff. How are these people surviving? And in truth, they're not in a lot of ways. We have a case then in October 1864. One of then the Dakota writing to Mr. Stephen Riggs talked about how the soldiers told the Dakota to throw their stoves out. So they had these wood-burning stoves within their barracks as a way to cook and keep warm, and apparently the soldiers then told them to throw them out. Now, we vary on different ways, different reasonings for why this might have happened. To the prisoners, they're these people are trying to kill us. It's October, it's going through a very cold fall, and we see people dropping of pneumonia left and right here. And so within tossing these out, it is then going to open that up. Now, we see from other sources then from the soldier side that General Benjamin Roberts actually ordered the stoves to be thrown out, one, because they're possibly getting new ones, but also he worried the Dakota would expose the barracks to burning as they are careless about their fires. And so if we see then that this is the way the commandant of the prison is going to see these people, where they're saying, hey, they can't even handle cooking with fire, that's going to put us in danger, that is also going to have large repercussions, it's going to show the conditions of the treatment within this prison. Also then, beginning off, the food quality was less than stellar. In the beginning, when they first got to the camp, the commander supplied the prisoners with coffee and sugar and other provisions, but they actually wrote to Washington saying, we don't need these luxuries. And so then those were cut off. It was also said then, as they were being first captured before the trials, that they should be given half rations, that they did not deserve full rations as, one, a means of punishment, but two, again, trying to say that, hey, these people are less than human. As time would go on, and Thomas Williamson is going to do a lot to advocate within local channels, basically, for the Dakota. He is going to write a few articles in local papers. He is also going to directly advocate then to the local government. What he basically is going to ask for then, he's stating then that they've received quantities of beef, salt, and corn, but only to then the point as shall be found necessary for the health of Dakota and to support life. Meaning then that they are giving starvation rations. The thing that's interesting, though, is that within Camp Kearney, literally right across the wall is the largest mustering point in the state of Iowa. They can see then the provisions that these new soldiers are receiving, and, well, the Iowan soldiers are eating good. And they're able to kind of compare back and forth, and there's a huge disparity in both the quality and the quantity of food that's being given out to, again, a much larger group of people. I think it's also fair to say that, like, if we look at it from a larger perspective, at the same time, there is a other prisoner of war camp that is on Fort Armstrong, where now like the Rock Island Arsenal is, that has 10,000 Confederate prisoners, and they also are featuring some other starvation issues as well. And so it seems to be more of a feature rather than a bug with the suppliers in this area. Let's see here. There's also going to be, let's see, I want to make sure I have my right part here. Yeah. And so within the level of sickness that's happening within the camps, right, these people are in very confined spaces. Pneumonia is going through, but also, too, there is going to be smallpox as well. And so the Daily Democrat of Davenport is going to report in 1864 that there's about 250 people left. 50 of them are in the hospital and in the pest house. Smallpox has gotten them and is thinning them out rapidly. Our numbers estimate that roughly 120 people died while interned in Camp Kearney. This is very preventable, right? If we would have seen better food quality, if we would have seen better construction, these people could have been saved. This is roughly going to be a quarter of the people that are going to die and be interned in unmarked graves. The thing that's also interesting too, right? So we do see a number of people that are dying. As these people are dying, they're being thrown out into, again, unmarked graves. And the people that are in the area, the local Iowans, are curious about these people, which I'll get to in a second. But they're so curious about these people that when they see a new grave being dug for in the Dakota, they let the soldiers finish, burying them. And then immediately they become grave robbers. And so they're going to attempt to then dig up these bodies as a means of collecting relics, as something that is kind of novel. We even have a case then that in 1878, so some years after, workers from the Davenport Academy of Natural Sciences opened up 4 graves and removed several skulls, which actually were at the Putnam Museum until 1986. They have since been interred back with the Dakota Nation in South Dakota, but just showing that, hey, there's this fascination that exists with these people, pseudoscience that is trying to, again, like, see them as a novelty, almost a fetishization. And I've already touched on this a little bit, but again, the commanders of the camp originally are going to see them and are going to treat them very brutally. For the first year and a half of their imprisonment, they're going to be kept in shackles, in chains. Many of these men still, profess their innocence. They're not dangerous people. They also forbade outside visitors unless specifically approved by the commander. They did not allow cultural practices such as dances or ball games that they would play. And also they were not allowed to receive gifts either. And so if there was a good-natured, a kind-hearted person that would look down upon these people, some of our missionaries would say, hey, we need to make sure that they have food. That would not have been allowed under that first year and a half. Outside viewing originally was not allowed by the prison, but there were so many people in Davenport that were clamoring to see the prisoners that they eventually allowed these people to almost become a zoo exhibit. And so it was allowed then for 2 hours every day that people within the community would be allowed to basically get up on the outside of the prison and look down into the camp. It's interesting, though, and I make the comparison to the Rock Island prison that was, again, within eyeshot, that they asked a very similar request to the head of the Confederate prisoner of war camp that was there. And their response was that these men are prisoners of war, and that is demeaning to them. That is not humane. And so showing then that there is this large hypocrisy between Native American prisoners of war to Confederate prisoners of war and the level that they're being treated, where the Confederates then are going to be seen with a level of humanity, whereas the Dakota then are going to be treated again like zoo exhibits. While this is sad, there is going to be a few bright spots. And I think that this is also then a show of resilience. So there's going to be a general loosening of restrictions. So generally then as time's going to go on, things are going to get better for the Dakota, right? There's going to be loosening restrictions because, well, they're going to realize that these people aren't dangerous. And so after a little bit, there's going to be a new commander that's going to come in. The shackles are going to be removed, but also the prisoners are going to enjoy more freedom as well. And this is what I find fascinating, is that in some of these cases, the prisoners are allowed to just leave the camp. Just leave the camp during the day. They might be allowed with a guard Sometimes they're not allowed, like sometimes they don't even have a guard with them. They're being rented out basically to like local farmers to clear land, but also they're getting a wide amount of autonomy, but they're performing actions like cutting wood, carrying water up from the river, and in general doing like other work that might be around the camp. But again, these are people that are supposedly convicted murderers that are just ambling around a town in Iowa, and there might be a guard that is a little bit a ways away, but like he's not really doing a whole lot. And so the fact that they're able to go from being bloodthirsty murderers that are like meant to be kind of viewed as less than human, now all of a sudden they're just out there. They're just doing things, which again is going to show almost like this level of fascination, but also trust that gets to build up as well. Let's see here. Yeah. We do have several examples of like groups of Dakota just kind of going around within the community. Different people are going to view it in different ways. There's going to be some white people in the area. They're going to be like, hey, like this is interesting. They're going to trade with them, which I'll get to here in a moment. But also too, there's going to be people that are going to say like, this is a nuisance, which is very fascinating because originally, these people are connected to the largest mass execution in American history. The people of Minnesota were out for blood. Originally, the people of Davenport were out for blood. And now all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, it's kind of annoying when they're in my yard. And so it's showing then this large shift where it's almost a sense of tolerance and acceptance, and again, seeing them as a novelty. All right, so let's see here. All right, so here's what Camp Kearney would have looked like. We have very few images of the camp itself. We have a decent amount of drawings they're able to take from it. You guys are able to see here, if you look on the outside, you can see a walkway that'd be going through there, and we can see the number of buildings that are inside. But again, this is around 200 square feet, where you're trying to stick roughly 400 people. Okay. And I've already gone into this a little bit with the reception from the local population. I received a source then from one historian that called how do I say this here? The local populace viewed the Dakota with both fear and fascination, right? And so as the Dakota first come out into Davenport then, the state of Minnesota is actually going to have a reward for Dakota scalps. They're going to say that for each Dakota male that has ended up to be scalped, it's $25 a piece. We have a source from the Daily Democrat in Davenport that is basically going to say, hey, we have $50,000 invested in East Davenport right now. And the sooner the government realizes on them, the better satisfied the people will be. Basically, they're saying, hey, we've got free money in this prison camp right here. What if we did something about it? And again, there is a very real fear by the Dakota that something might happen. But again, the overall idea of fascination is going to take over much quicker. And so we already talked about how there's going to be a lot of people coming in to view the Dakota off the boats, but also then that's going to mention that, like, hey, people from all around are going to want to see them. And again, they're going to want to peer into the camp as well. And it's interesting to see what they find. There's an article that, again, talks about, like, basically breaking in and taking these people's scalps. But also in the same article, they're talking about how devout these people are, how they're good Christians. And so we have cases where they are in circles, they're singing hymns, they're preaching the gospel in the Dakota language, and the white people of Davenport love this. They're able to see them as like assimilated to an extent, thus making them more safe. And this is a common thread that we're able to see, is that as the Dakota are going to become, quote unquote, more assimilated to whatever extent that is real, they're going to receive better treatment. There's also a level of fascination. Little Crow's daughter is going to be held within the prison. There is, again, a fascination with her. Within this article, it says that she's an Indian princess and that she must be a belle amongst Indian damsels. Basically saying, hey, it's a real-life Pocahontas that's living here among us. What a novelty to have. Okay. Here's just a rough outline, again, of like what the camp would look like. I do have another map here that will show this in more of a modern context. This next image is the only image we have of Camp Kearney itself. And so this would actually be the hospital. Most of the other buildings then, by the time the Dakota are released in 1866, will actually have fallen down due to the poor construction, which again is going to not be in the favor of the Dakota. Okay, let's talk about their survival, right? So they're within this camp from 1863 to 1866, and they're just trying to find ways that they're able to survive. One thing I want to touch on, though, is that when these people are convicted of murder, they're sentenced to death, they are going to be separated from their families. And so The men that go down to Davenport, their families are at the same time are going to be taken to a reservation in South Dakota called Crow Creek. Crow Creek is going to feature a lot of the same issues that we're going to see in Camp Kearney, where there's not going to be great treatment by the white soldiers there to start off with. There's going to be a lack of food. There's going to be very poor conditions and very bad planning. But also the way that we need to think about this as well is that their families are being held hostage. That if the Dakota act out in any way, shape, or form, they don't know what might happen to their family. We have several letters then from Dakota writing to Riggs or Williamson saying, hey, I'm not sure if my wife is still alive. Because again, they've been separated because they're in Crow Creek and they're separated by hundreds of miles. And so the whole aim that the Dakota have is to get to their families because again, we have that very strong kinship tie. Okay. And when I'm looking at the ways that the Dakota are able to survive, I'm really looking at 3 ways. The first part, though, is through the avenue of the missionaries. And so they're looking at it through education, but also to say through like conversion or assimilation. And so within, how do I say this here? Within the camp, Stephen Riggs, one of our missionaries, sees the Dakota here as a captive audience, right? He's like, they can't go anywhere. What are they going to do, right? And so he sees it as an opportunity for a religious education training school. And so he's going to start off to work. There's a couple Dakota that would have already gone to like missionary boarding schools back before the war that are going to kind of serve as catalysts. But again, the schools are going to be different. They're going to be outside the norm. Again, religious conversion is going to be the goal for the missionaries, not simply education. But again, they are going to have a school, and it's something for these people to do. It's widely successful. So before the Dakota War, like a lot of other cases, the Dakota did not care about the mission schools. They were very sparsely attended. I believe the largest school they had 94 pupils that attended very intermittently. By the time we get to this internment, 200 out of the 250 prisoners would attend school regularly and could read and write and were eager to learn more, as we have from our sources. And again, why are they doing this, right? They are not being forced in any way, shape, or form, right? So that's not compelled, right? But there are some incentives for them to do this. One, the government aspects, the military aspects within the prison hate that they're being educated. They hate that they're being educated because, again, knowledge is power. And so by then learning to read and write in your own language, that these Dakota were able to say, hey, look at us. We are able to then be at this level. We have this agency over ourselves, and you can't stop us. We also then see as well that, again, it's again this form of protest, but also, too, you're in a camp, it's really tight conditions, and you're bored. What else are you going to do? I would also like to say that if I was stuck in a very small room and I couldn't scroll on my phone, I would try to read something if it was there. Now, what is going to end up making this a successful school? Because, again, most people are going to attend. They're going to learn how to read and write. And so the missionaries, again, are being flexible, and they're willing to meet the Dakota where they're at, and the Dakota are going to use that to their advantage. And so they're going to be basically divided into classes, and normally then they're in most mission school situations, they're going to try to again to erase those cultural ties as much as possible. But what's going to end up actually happening is they're going to follow cultural ties. They're going to then arrange by clan. They're also then going to use kind of like an elder system then that you would see within traditional Dakota practices. And so you would have an elder who would then again be like a teacher. And there would also be like a class community then where there's individual accountability then to make sure your other people are learning. The thing that's interesting about this is going to show that one, right, that there's that flexibility, but also as well that there is going to be Dakotas that are going to be in charge of their own education. That these elders are going to say that are going to be in a position to be educated, and they're going to have to that ability to take it back to their reservation and then be responsible for training up their next generation, which in a lot of other cases, other tribes are not as fortunate. Another reason then why people are going to want to be educated is just the value in letter writing. Again, these people are separated from their families, from their children, and there's going to be a slew of letters that are going to be written between them. Again, by 1864, most had learned to read and write, and they spent a lot of their time, effort, and also money on materials then that could help them write letters or to send back to their families. Every time that the mail basically came to the prison in Davenport, roughly between 100 to 300 letters arrived every time, and the same amount was being sent back. And so you have this interesting back and forth of, again, being able to write to your loved ones or then to write out to the missionaries to advocate again that, hey, we should be freed. The other thing that's interesting, though, is that they're writing in Dakota, which I'll just say this here. One of the missionaries put it very bluntly, is that, well, it's going to be free censorship. There is no probability of white men learning Dakota. And so all of a sudden then you have this situation where you are able to communicate freely with people on the outside, where then again you're able to speak very clearly, candidly, and honestly, where again in a lot of other prison situations where things could be heavily censored, that's not simply the case. And also then too, let's get to conversion, right? Within this level of assimilation, we can understand then that the more that the Dakota assimilated, the better they would be treated. Now, I'm not here to argue anyone's sincerity of faith. There is an interesting part about Dakota faith where, again, they're going to see holiness in everything, and so then adopting parts of Christian culture is not so unfound. But that is beside the point. They're going to rely on this view, at least to advance ties, right? They're going to try to basically cozy up to some of the missionaries, right, in a way, and like, if you want to cozy up to them, you got to convert. You got to write letters saying, hey, I believe in the Great Spirit. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to stop having multiple wives. I'm going to stop practicing like traditional Dakota medicine, which is going to be another sticking point. Many of the surviving letters that we do have do follow along those things. We have large themes of like repentance for sins, for advocating again for their innocence, saying that, hey, we believe in the Great Spirit. We should then be treated better. Now, again, were they real conversions? We do see then that, well, like as the Dakota end up being released, there is going to be a drop-off in church attendance, but also I would say largely today, a lot of the Dakota are going to practice some form of Christian tradition, so it is more difficult then to parse that through. But again, as the Dakota attempt to show them their Christianity, one, it's going to show to the missionaries that they are worth saving. Hey, keep fighting for us. We are meeting you where we're at. We are going to continue then believing in this religion that you want us to believe in so badly. Also then to the outside people in Davenport, they're like, oh, hey, like I said earlier, they're devout. They're singing hymns. They're not that different from us. We shouldn't like murder them. Who would have thought? And so that's going to also advance into some other points of advocacy. So again, just to summarize, these people are being educated. They're doing so differently, right? They're learning and reading in Dakota. They're able to practice that language. Originally, again, this alphabet was developed as a way to control the Dakota, whereas then now they're able to then advance their culture. They're able to have control over their own education, and they're able to advance that way. Same thing with the conversion here, right? Shutting down Dakota like traditions, shutting down Dakota culture to an extent that is happening right from the outside, but again, that as a means then to be able to escape their captivity. All right, and then the last part of advocacy I want to get to is their business side. I tried to like form this into some kind of pun, and I was kind of stuck on it, so I just kind of stuck with business. They're being very entrepreneurial. I believe in my writing I refer to them as hustlers, right? Because I teach high school kids, and they're like, I'm on my grind. I'm out here, we're working. And so that's what they're doing here, and they realize then that there's a fascination with them. And so they are going to use that to the best of their advantage. And so on our left here is Jerome Big Eagle. He is going to be one of the head war chiefs within the Dakota War itself, and he is then also going to be interned in Davenport. This is an image of him taken in 1864. On the right side are there going to be some trinkets that are going to be made by the Dakota while they're within Davenport itself. And so, again, as time went on, there's more freedom. And so a lot of these Dakota are able to go out, and they're basically collecting any supplies they can get their hands on to make stuff, because they understand that people want like what they're about. They're interested in them. They see them as foreign objects, as something then that is new, that is novel. And so by 64, Riggs is going to report that everyone was busy making rings, crosses, water chains, etc. They presented me with 50 rings, a dozen hatchets, a few fish, and also a couple large birds. They also then began to make things like moccasins, beadwork, and other ornaments in this process as well. Their biggest seller was bows and arrows, which, I mean, if you think about anything, like younger kids are going to want a bow and arrow now as much as they would back then. The other thing too, though, is that they are right next door to a bunch of Civil War soldiers that are getting back from fighting that are now all of a sudden going to be getting their pay. So they're going to be flush with cash, and they're going to want to have a souvenir when they go back. And so the Civil War returning soldiers are also going to be very big buyers for the Dakota as well. They're going to make a lot of money off of it. And so they're going to be doing some selling. They're going to be making a good amount of money, but also too, again, they're getting some of those cultural connections. Another thing that I came across that I thought was really interesting was they participated in some races. I'm talking like a foot race. And so in 1864, some of the Camp Kearny prisoners are going to be transported actually here. They're going to bring in some racehorses from Chicago, and they're going to run a series of races in and around Muscatine. And so we're going to see like different lengths. There's going to be one that's going to be 4 miles, one that's going to be 8, and there's going to be a couple shorter races as well. The Dakota actually wins some of these races, and they're receiving anywhere between $500 to $100 to $50. And now, within this context, we have newspaper accounts that are going to speak about the Dakota very like demeaningly, basically saying like, "Hey, they're they're running with beasts, ha 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 ha." But again, well, I'll say this: the Dakota can laugh their way to the bank. Because again, they're winning in some of these races. They're saying, hey, we're going to take advantage of the situation. We're going to use this money then to purchase our own supplies, to send it back to our families for our own advantages. There's also cases too of them doing like dances for like different people. There's one case of the Dakota dancing in like the Scott County Fair. The missionaries did not like this because it promoted, again, like traditional Dakota religious practices. The other part that I came across that was very interesting was paid appearances. Jerome Big Eagle was actually offered by the newspaper to sit down for a photo. He got all ready. He found his finest like wear that he had on him, and they were getting ready to go down to the studio. And the story goes that he started to kind of take off his headdress. He started to like, take off the beads he had. And they asked like, what's the deal? Why don't you want to do this? And he's like, you know what? I only do it if I get paid. And he kind of has them, and he is able to basically be like, hey, you know what, you have to pay me $15, which would be $300 today, and they do so on the spot. He ends up sitting down for this picture. Now, this is an interesting picture, and Stephanie Pratt, a historian, makes a really interesting argument that I thought I would repeat here as well to express a point. Within this is showing a means of self-expression and self-representation. He's wearing 6 eagle feathers. He has a gunstock club, showing then that he is his importance as a warrior, but the blade has been removed then to show a sense of peacefulness. He posed without a gun, thus insisting on a more native-based understanding of warfare and indigenous significance systems. And so this image was meant then to show Jerome Big Eagle as a fetish, as somebody then again is meant to be shown off, in a sense pacified, but he is using it to his own advantages, and he's getting paid for it as well. And so within this context, we're able to see the Dakota, through different means, are able to then ensure their own survival, right? Whether it's then through their business side, through learning language and passing on letters, or then through adopting some Christian practices as well. Now, let's talk about release and remembrance a little bit here. And so as they're being released, right, so the entire time they're trying to say, hey, we should be free, we should be free, we should be free. It's difficult because people see these people as murderers still. And so the first thing they try to do is receive pardons for them. And so Thomas Williamson is going to take some of the money that the Dakota make from selling their trinkets, and they're going to go to D.C., which also shows that they're able to make that much money to afford this guy to go to Washington, D.C. He's going to meet with Abraham Lincoln and also the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and both of them are like, hey, this is ridiculous. These people should be pardoned, and we should work then towards getting them out of Camp Kearny. The problem is John Wilkes Booth has his own plans, and Lincoln ends up getting shot, and the Dakota are going to be stuck there for an additional 2 years while Andrew Johnson is going to be figuring things out. And that's kind of what it is. Like, it's just kind of like a holding pattern, basically. By the time it gets across Johnson's desk, he's going to pardon everyone, and they're going to be released, and then they are going to make their way to South Dakota, and also northern Nebraska and the Niobrara area. At the time then of their release, April 10th, 1866, there is going to be 177 Sioux that are going to be remaining. And they, for the most part, are going to go to Nebraska and then eventually go into South Dakota. This time is referred to also as the Dakota diaspora because being forced out of Minnesota, and we see a widespread of Dakota just going with the winds. Some are going to relocate to Nebraska, South Dakota. The more warlike factions that did take in part in some massacres did end up going to Canada. Little Crow actually ends up making it there and ends up coming back to Minnesota and is killed after a little bit. And also, too, there are some Dakota that have since returned to Minnesota and live in small communities there. But again, we do see them eventually getting out due to advocacy by the missionaries then that are advocating on their behalf. They get an eventual release, and thank goodness they do, because again, sickness is still spreading through the camp. The buildings are falling apart, and especially after going through a long winter, I'm sure that they would be happy to go see their families. Okay, the Camp Kearney today. And so Camp Kearney, the struggle with trying to remember this is that it was not meant to be permanent. And so a lot of these buildings have since fallen apart. I only had one image to show you guys. Today, it's houses. And so there's also some archaeological issues that come up with that as well. And so in the early 20th century, they start digging up some of these foundations, some of these basements, and they're finding graves of the Dakota there as well, which also gets played up in some of the newspapers too with like the whole Indian burial ground thing. The neighborhood is now known as McClellan Heights, signifying then the Camp McClellan that is there, but there is nothing then that is going to note Camp Kearney, which is showing then our willingness societally then to remember certain parts of history over others. Currently then in Lindsay Park in Davenport, Iowa, is the sole reminder of the camp. And actually the sign itself it's mostly about Camp McClellan. It's basically saying like there's like one sentence, I would call it a clause even, that talks about Camp Kearney. And so I've had enough information to talk your guys' ears off about this. I find it ridiculous that there's a rock with a plaque on it. That's just me. Now, there's also then going to be a little bit more here. So if you guys ever get a chance to drive through the village of East Davenport and you guys go up this street right here, why am I blanking on the name right now? This is going to drive me crazy. But I was actually able to, the houses are still there. Like, if you actually look through some of these buildings, some of them are built like when this image was taken. This was taken in 1927 after a photojournalist had interviewed a person who was alive when Camp Kearney was still standing. He said then that the camp wall would have been where those grove of trees are. And so today, there's houses there. And they seem nice. I hope they're doing okay. Okay, here we go. That's what it is. Crestwood Terrace would be then where the road would be that the camp would have been on. But again, now it's residential neighborhoods. They're doing more to remember Camp McClellan than they will do to remember this concentration camp in this setting. Okay. So thank you for being here. I know we had a little technical difficulties. I sound ridiculous when I talk. And, well, there's a lot of stuff to cover. If you guys would like, we could do question and answer here. If you guys do have anything. Anybody? Yeah. Yeah. And so like within the Dakota, right? So like within their imprisonment, they had a few children that were there. It was very lacking in terms of like childcare and also like worrying about like their overall welfare. If that makes sense. And so the women that were there, they were expected to take care of these kids, but also the people who ran the camp saw them as workers, right? Their primary job was then to do the cooking and the cleaning. And so their time was more spent with that rather than actually taking care of these kids. And they would have also, again being raised in kind of like a cesspool-like environment. There's also other cases then. I did come across a few other minority groups that were being encountered with during this time, and it's not great either. We have a couple cases of early on where soldiers are mistreating some African-American kids that are in the streets of Davenport as well while they're marching around with some of the Dakota prisoners too. And so if we're talking about, hey, like the development of a child welfare system, it's really not there, which is really unfortunate, especially then when we think about reform movements that would have existed more towards the East Coast and larger cities, and like starting like the 1830s, 1840s, where we would start to see more of a care about that, but unfortunately that's not here. Does that answer your question? And that's kind of what I'm finding out, right? Is that it seems like there's been a few articles that have been posted in the Annals of Iowa. Based off the scholarship that I've been reading through this project, I think it's coming back is maybe the way that I would say it. And so one of the sources I leaned on a lot for this was a series of letters that were written by the Dakota prisoners that were then passed on to Stephen Riggs. And so we have about 50 of those that have been translated. There are still more that needs to be translated. And so there's some attention there. Another historian who did a really great job, and I read a lot of her work for this, her name is Linda Clemens. She's a professor at Illinois State University. If you guys would like to read some of her books, I bought too many of them, but she deserves the money. But she actually ended up winning a local history award in the state of Iowa back in 2020 for her work, Dakota in Exile, or was it Conflicted Missions? But she wrote extensively then on both the imprisonment in Davenport and also then the relationship between the Dakota and the missionaries. And so I would like to say that I do think there's more scholarship that's happening here. I do think specifically the Iowa portion needs to be remembered better. Minnesota does a really good job of kind of coming to terms with this. There are marches every year that kind of commemorate the war and the conflict. Each individual kind of city has different monuments that would go back to it. There's remembrance days. Every year, there's a couple 100-mile march that takes place from basically where the Dakota were being captured at and then where they were being held at. That last time I checked, it happens every year. And so it becomes a very big thing for the Dakota to remember and also the people in southern Minnesota, but far in between, not so much. Yeah, there was a couple things that I'm just wow, I don't get the time to talk about this. My original topic that I wanted to look at, which I wish I had more time to do this. There's never enough time. I already mentioned a little bit, but there's a prison camp that exists in Rock Island at the same time then that could have served as a really interesting case study to kind of compare back and forth. One thing that's also really interesting about that environment as well is that within the Rock Island prison camp, there is the Graybeards, which if you guys know about Muscatine history, there was a group of anybody above the age of 45 from Muscatine that wanted to pick up a gun and serve guard duty, and so they're the oldest regiment that exists in the Civil War, and so they're guarding that prison camp. There's also going to be a regiment of black soldiers that are going to be up there as well, and so it'd be really interesting to take a closer look then at hey, we have this weird, I would say unique swirling of races in prison camps that really is not going to exist in many other places, and so that could be very interesting. I would just say growing up with a religious background, going to a Christian college for this program, I was very interested in Dakota theology and the way that the missionaries were able to make it relevant for them. And so the way that they were able to translate certain things and the way that they utilized language I found to be fascinating. It didn't necessarily fit entirely in here. The more I kind of dove into stuff, I'm trying to cover a lot. But getting to talk about the finer intricacies of the way that they were able to explain the idea of, I'll just use the word Yahweh, to within the Dakota and trying to explain ideas of Trinitarian theology while also trying to then say, hey, you can't worship multiple things at the same time too, becomes a very interesting concept. The other part too about just the development of mission schools, which I kind of tied on a little bit too, and just the language part. I hope you guys found that as interesting as I did, where my head is spinning when they're wait, they're actually teaching them in their native language. Oh, they're actually going to learn to read and they're going to write in their own language, whereas again, that's not happening everywhere. And so I think that was another avenue that I got to touch on a little bit, but I didn't get to explore as much as I wanted. Anybody else? Yes. Yeah. And so I think about my current context, and I currently teach AP US History up at the high school, and so I think I'm fortunate that I do actually get that opportunity. I think one of the ways that I would most go about doing this is I don't necessarily know if I want to try to explain this to a student. I think in a lot of ways, and I think within education, we need to utilize more inquiry-based type approaches. And so I think what I would like to do is I would want to take some of the sources that I have here. I think I found a good number of quotes, and I would ask the students then, what do we notice here, right? How is this different from the status quo that we might see at this time? And how does this challenge some of our notions about race, about Native Americans at this time? And what can we take away from it? Because again, any good historian is going to ask questions. And I think if we want to truly teach kids to be as passionate about a topic as I am right now, it's, hey, take it and run with it. Find what you want to learn about this. And I hope that we would come to the same ideas about justice and equity and kind of what that means within American values as we would. And that turns into a great discussion. But I also think too, like if you want students to understand something, right, let them take it where they want to, and we can talk about the larger implications. And they can argue to me whether or not they think it's relevant, right? Because that's what history is. It's a bunch of nerdy people who spend a lot of time in libraries that are all arguing about why they're right or why their other person is wrong. And so if we try to distill that and we try to put that within our classrooms, we're gonna see a lot better results because of that. Does that make sense? Yeah, and especially I think about the kids that I have now, like if I actually have time to go through that, they'll rock it. Really good conversations in there. Anybody else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I want to say with Williamson, he's going to end up, so he's going to spend a lot of time with them within, like the Davenport setting. He's fairly old by the time it kind of falls out. And the other thing too, and I did not get to talk about it as much because it turned into another aside, they're sponsored by like a missionary organization that's based out of Boston, who's kind of strapped for cash. And so, it becomes kind of a financial thing where can they really go on with a lot of these things? And so Williamson's going to kind of fall off a little bit. Riggs is going to end up going to Beloit, Wisconsin, so not too far from here. He's going to end up living and dying there. I believe he dies in the 70s, 80s, if I remember correctly. And so, like, they'll still have contact. I know Thomas Williamson's son is going to do a lot. He's also kind of there in the background serving as a translator, and also then doing some missionary work that he will be working in the Crow Creek Reservation, doing some more advocacy. But yeah, just because Williamson's age. And then Riggs, again, financial reasons is what I would maybe lean towards. He'll end up kind of falling off. But there's still like a close relationship. There's still letter writings. Riggs is going to publish his journals in, I want to say, like 1860, like I think 6 or 7. And that's going to get a little bit read as well within missionary circles, but also like from the nation as well. And so there's going to be some, I would say, like promoting, but that like direct mission to mission, that's going to be for the next generation of missionaries during that time. Anybody else? Speak now, forever hold your peace. All right. Well, thanks for having me. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thanks. All right, everybody, you're dismissed. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all for attending this event series this evening and lecture. If you have any follow-up questions, I'm sure Nick will be around for a few minutes. Once again, I'm Kirk Thompson, and thanks for attending this evening. Get home safe and stay cozy.